Welcome to the Upstate Interview Series. I'm Luke Perry. Today we have Sherri Cash, Associate Professor of History at Utica College. Sherri is working on a new book on social history focused on diversity, activism, and equity in New York. Welcome, Sherri.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Based on your research, my first question has to do with the theme that you've mentioned elsewhere, and that is New York is not immune to prejudices central to U.S. history. Based on your research, can you share a prominent example that comes to mind?
Sure. Well, right off the bat, of course, New York colony was a slave colony. And prior to that, New Netherland was a slave colony. And often students are surprised to learn that slavery wasn't abolished in New York State until 1827. We weren't quite last, though. New Jersey holds that distinction. But New York was not exactly on the cutting edge of the abolition of slavery in the North. So that immediately comes to mind. There, of course, are other examples.
Do you think that's something that deserves more attention in curriculum and public schools and so forth, or do you think they cover that sufficiently?
If everything that I hear about the schools, even at the moment, and the experience of my own children, I would say yes, it needs to be covered. It is not covered adequately, and needs to be. Absolutely.
Thank you. Certainly a difficult history. Now, your research has looked at community organizing and protest over time in New York, and your book takes a very long view covering the state's entire history, which is quite impressive. I hope you could help us sort of break down some similarities and differences between major periods, perhaps starting with early statehood compared to the early 20th century.
In terms of how people organized or what the issues were?
Yes, I'm curious, different issues, different methods, themes that you've encountered.
Well, certainly there's a long history of resistance in many ways. People who push back against the circumstances they found themselves in. There's so many examples that I could pull out. So I'll just go with one that is coming to mind, and that is in the antebellum period, so the early 19th century. There's really, we can see, in a sense, an ongoing revolution, right? The prior generation had fought in or been alive during the revolution, had a memory of that, and now in the early 19th century, it's clear that those founding ideals that to this day are central to our political culture were not realized. So it's white working class men, it's African Americans, it's women as a group, and so there's this. There tends to be a view of American history that just sort of democracy is unfolding naturally. And I would say that would extend to New York history on the state level. Also, this idea of democracy is just sort of naturally unfolding, but actually it's really about people who are making those changes happen. And so in the early 19th century, of course, there's not only an abolition movement, but a struggle for Black equality. Women begin to call for social rights, as well as a reform of laws that were discriminatory along gender lines, and as well as the vote. That was the most controversial one, though it wasn't actually what most women would have wanted first. There were more pressing matters, but those are a few examples of the ways that people are trying to make the American Revolution their own.
Thanks so much. And when you think about what's going on today, it's common for people to compare that in some ways to the 1960s. How about in terms of what you've been focused on in regards to New York State? Do you see parallels? Do you see more differences than commonalities when you think about what's going on presently compared to the 1960s?
Oh, well, yeah, I mean, there are similarities, absolutely. And, I think really you could even roll that back to the World War II era and sort of the rhetoric of that war. After the war, those ideals have not been realized. And then moving into the 60s, there is really and with the Black Civil Rights Movement, setting the stage and serving as a model for many other groups. In the 1960s, there's this real flourishing of protest. And, in terms of what's going on now, I think, again, we're seeing a moment where there is a recognition of a failure of earlier promises to be realized, or, for the country to live up to its own ideals. And so most fundamentally, I would say, yes, there is, there is quite a lot of similarity.
Thank you. And when you think of the biggest challenges facing the country, or New York State in particular, when it comes to diversity and equity, what comes to mind?
Well, what comes to mind is ongoing segregation. Over time, communities have become even more segregated, and with that, schools. Certainly there are ways that as a state and as a nation, we've made tremendous progress, but in other ways, not so much. So in terms of New York State, and, just an example from upstate, if we, look at the residential and just in general racial segregation of, say, the city of Syracuse would be one example. Here in the Utica area, when we look at, studies have done this, looking at communities right on either side of a dividing line, right, of a geographical line. Well, Utica and New Hartford are very starkly segregated. It's one of the most segregated spots in the country. So, most starkly segregated spots in the country. So, we still have those problems, and along with the racial segregation, what's wrapped up there is also a class segregation, and again, that affects the public schools. And so there's a real, a very pernicious and far-reaching effect of that kind of demographic reality.
Thank you very much. So when policymakers hopefully try to address this, based on your research, what does history tell us we should keep in mind, or do, or not do?
Well, of course, in history, we don't make predictions or something, context is always absolutely central to our understanding, and contexts change. However, there are similarities. We can't deny that. And so I would say, looking to the past for some sort of, as a usable past for us today, certainly politics is critical to, how policy is going to unfold, and where we can try to provide better representation. That again goes to residents and even redistricting, as that comes up every so often. So I think that's really key. I think that, we have to try not to take for granted too much our reputation as a state as being a liberal state. I mean, on the scale of national politics, certainly New York is. But, I think that we have to look a little more closely at, various zones within the state and try to understand how that affects then politics at the state level. So, I think that representation, although it's getting better in the legislature, especially among the younger generation of elected officials, we have to keep going in that direction, and we have to, I think, always take a hard look at how does representation really pan out. And I'm not sure if that's anything concrete, but I would say politics is a key area, not the only one.
Sure. No, I think that's a great start. Thank you. And how about everyday New Yorkers who have concerns about the issues you've researched from a historical perspective and from diversity and equity? Is there a particular story or person that you've encountered in your research that you think is particularly illustrative to the types of things that people on a daily basis can do to try to address these concerns?
That's a great question. On a daily basis, I mean, absolutely community organizing. Yeah, just one example. Gosh, my mind is flooded with examples. Something that comes to mind is the Puerto Rican community of the 1960s, and then going forward, a community of migrants, right? Right, Puerto Ricans are American citizens, but come to New York in large, in increasing numbers over the 20th century, and really had the experience of being outsiders, being regarded as outsiders. Well, one of the things that community does in various cities, most centrally New York City, because most folks went there, but say the city of Rochester, which, held, it might even now, I'm not sure, the largest Puerto Rican population in the state, at least in the 60s and 70s. Organizing at the community level and really trying to, run someone from within the community in politics, having that voice, that was very important. That's one example. There's a long history of petitioning and pressuring the legislature, particularly say after, beginning in 1972, there, and for some different reasons, there's a real push among African Americans and also women as a group to very intentionally lobby the legislature, and then also to continue to run candidates. We think about something like the AIDS crisis in the 1980s, where the LGBT community is organizing at the local level around that, and in all the cities of New York, really, where there's an LGBT community, organizing around that issue and then trying to get public attention in any way that they could. There was a lot of criticism around that their tactics were, too militant, too shocking, but it got attention. And, there was even a successful impact on the Food and Drug Administration that then made a drug available quickly to address the crisis. So, I think that there are all kinds of things that can be done in daily life. We don't all have to be the one at the front of the crowd protesting. There are all kinds of ways to do that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sherri Cash. I look forward to reading your book on social history in New York. Thank you all for watching. For more, you can go to ucpublicaffairs.com.